My stepmother looked me straight in the eyes and said, "If you want to stay here, you're paying rent. My kids don't have to, just you." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. This was my dad's house. The place I grew up in. The place he always told me would be mine one day. Now he was gone, and I had come back thinking I could take care of the home, maybe even feel close to him again. Instead, I was standing in my own living room, being told to pay to live there. After my father died, I thought the house would naturally become mine. I knew my stepmother would still live here too, but I didn't think it would be a problem. We'd never been close, but I figured we could be civil. When I arrived, though, I found she had already moved her 2 grown children into the spare bedroom. They had their feet up on the furniture, their shoes on the couch, as if they'd been here forever. They didn't even bother to say hello. I asked her about it, and she just shrugged. They need a place to stay. They're family, she said. I guess family didn't include me. A few days later, she called me into the kitchen. She had that smug little smile she always wore when she thought she was being clever. "We need to talk about rent," she said. "Rent?" I repeated. "Yes. You can't just live here for free. My kids are family. They don't have to pay. But you will." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or say she was joking, but she didn't. She just kept looking at me like she was daring me to argue. I thought about telling her no. I thought about yelling, but I'd just lost my job, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. I was already drowning in grief. Fighting her felt impossible, so I agreed. I told myself it was temporary, a few $100s a month until I could get back on my feet. I figured it would keep the peace. But as the days went by, I started to see how she really felt about me. She made big home-cooked dinners for her kids and left me to fend for myself. She let them leave their mess everywhere, but snapped at me if I left a coffee mug in the sink. She praised her kids for the smallest things, taking out the trash, washing a single plate, while ignoring everything I did. Every time I handed her rent money, I noticed she'd spend it on things for them. New clothes, gadgets, even taking them out for meals. I was paying to live in my own home while they lived here for free, eating my share of the food, using my father's things like they'd always been there. I tried to ignore it, but the resentment started growing quietly like a slow burn I couldn't put out. I was in my 2nd year of college when my dad told me he was getting remarried. I remember sitting in the little diner near campus, staring at the cup of coffee between us. He looked happy, almost nervous, like he was waiting for me to approve. I didn't know much about her, just that she worked at some insurance office and had 2 kids around my age. When I finally met her, she was polite but distant. She had that way of looking at people like she was measuring them. I tried to be friendly, but there was always this wall between us. Even in the early days, it felt like she was claiming parts of my dad's life for herself and her kids, and I was the visitor. Dad loved her, though. I could tell. And he loved this house. He built so much of it himself, fixed the porch, planted the garden out back, painted every room more than once. More than once, he told me. "No matter what happens, this place will always be yours one day. It's our family home." He kept the deed in his name, and I never doubted him. After they married, I only came home during breaks. The house felt different. There were new rules, her rules. I had to call before visiting. I had to stay in the guest room, even though my old bedroom was still there. She decorated everything in her style, putting away the photos of me and Dad, replacing them with pictures of her kids. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. I was busy with school, and Dad was happy. That was enough for me. Then a few years later, I got the call. It was sudden, an accident. One day he was here, and the next he was gone. I drove home in a haze, barely able to process it. When I walked into the house, she was already in charge. People from her side of the family filled the living room. My father's things were pushed into boxes in the corner, like they were already waiting for me to take them away. I thought I'd at least have the comfort of knowing the house was mine. But when the will was read, I found out the truth. My dad had left it to both of us, jointly. She wasn't just living here because she'd been married to him. She legally owned half of it now. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was angry, but another part thought maybe we could manage. I had just lost my job and couldn't afford rent anywhere else, so I asked if I could stay for a while. I told her I'd help fix things up, keep the place nice, maybe even make it feel like a real home again. She smiled in that tight way she always did and said it was fine. But from the start, she treated me like I was a guest, not an owner. She'd make little comments. "You're lucky I'm letting you stay here," or move my things without asking. If her kids wanted something, they got it immediately. If I needed anything, I had to ask twice and still might not get it. I walked through the rooms my dad had built and fixed and painted, and I could barely recognize them. She had taken down the old curtains he'd chosen, replaced the furniture, covered the walls in colors he never would have picked. It was like she was trying to erase every trace of him, and by extension me. Even then, I kept telling myself it was temporary. I'd get back on my feet, save some money, and figure things out. But deep down, I could feel something shifting. This wasn't just about losing my dad. It was about losing the place that was supposed to be mine, the one thing he'd promised would always belong to me. It didn't take long before she started setting conditions, and they were aimed only at me. One morning, she knocked on my door and handed me a sheet of paper. At the top, she'd written house guidelines in neat handwriting. I read through it, feeling a knot form in my stomach. No overnight guests. No using the main bathroom if her kids needed it. No leaving dishes in the sink for more than an hour. Quiet after 9 at night. Her children ignored every restriction. They had friends over late, blasted music, and left dirty plates all over the kitchen. No one said a word to them, but if I left a glass on the counter, she'd comment about keeping the place tidy. Then came the bills. She told me I'd be covering part of the utilities, electricity, water, internet. I was already paying rent, but she acted as if I was still getting a free ride. Every time a bill arrived, she'd knock on my door with the amount written on a sticky note and say, "Here's your share." Meanwhile, her kids didn't hand over a cent. They didn't work, spent their days sprawled on the couch or in bed, and raided the fridge constantly. More than once I came home to find the food I'd bought completely gone. When I confronted her, she'd shrug and say, "This is a shared home. You can't claim things just for yourself." Little changes started happening around the house. A brand new couch appeared in the living room. Her son had a massive gaming setup in his bedroom. The hallway walls were freshly painted. I realized my rent money was going towards small renovations that only benefited her kids. My own room still had peeling wallpaper and a closet door hanging off its hinges. What made it worse was the way she spoke to me. If I mentioned how much I was paying, she'd roll her eyes and call me entitled. She'd say, "Most people your age would kill to have a roof over their head," as if I should feel lucky to be funding her lifestyle. Her kids joined in too. If I left for work or came back with groceries, they'd mutter under their breath, "Oh look, the tenant's off to work. Better not break any of Mom's guidelines." They smirked like it was some inside joke. She never told them to stop. Every day, I felt more like a stranger in my own home. I couldn't invite anyone over. I couldn't relax in the living room without feeling watched. Even my groceries didn't last more than a day. She liked reminding me she was in control. If I left the front door unlocked for even a minute, she'd say, "This isn't your little college apartment anymore." If I forgot to turn off a light, she'd point out how much the electricity bill had gone up and how I was lucky she was splitting it with me. I told myself I just had to survive a little longer, but each day made it clearer. I was the only one in that house carrying any responsibility, while everyone else lived comfortably at my expense. I came home one afternoon and noticed something was wrong before I even reached my room. The door was slightly open, even though I had locked it that morning. When I pushed it wider, I saw fresh scratches around the lock and a crack near the frame. My stomach dropped. Inside, my things were out of place. The drawers I kept shut were hanging open, and clothes were tossed across the bed. I went straight to the small box where I kept a few valuable items, some jewelry from my dad, a watch he'd given me for graduation, and some cash I'd been saving. The box was there, but the watch and some of the jewelry were gone. I marched into the living room, where her son was sitting on the couch with a video game controller in his hand. I asked him if he'd been in my room. He didn't even look up, just shook his head and said, "Nope." Later that evening, I passed by his room on the way to the bathroom and froze. He was sitting at his desk, wearing my watch. The same one I had just seen missing from the box. I stood there for a second, trying to process the boldness of it. When I stepped inside and asked him about it, he smirked and said, "I found it lying around. Didn't think you'd mind." I went straight to his mother. She was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, acting like everything was perfectly normal. I told her what had happened, expecting her to be at least a little concerned. Instead, she set the knife down, looked me in the eye, and said, "He's family. You're just my late husband's kid." It was like a switch flipped inside me. All the little things, the favoritism, the way she spoke to me, the way she spent my money, suddenly made sense. I wasn't part of her family. I was an inconvenience, an obstacle between her and full control of the house. Up until then, I had told myself it was easier to stay quiet, to not start fights. But at that moment, I knew that if I kept letting her walk over me, it would only get worse. I wasn't just going to stand there while she and her kids took whatever they wanted. I didn't argue with her anymore that night. I went back to my room, sat down, and started thinking about what I could do. I realized that if I ever wanted things to change, I needed proof. Proof of how they were treating me, proof of what they were doing with my money, proof that I wasn't safe in my own home. That night, I took photos of the scratches on my door and the broken frame. I wrote down the time I had discovered the missing items and exactly what was gone. I kept my voice calm and acted as if nothing had happened, but inside, I was already planning my next move. From then on, I kept a small notebook hidden in my bag. Every time something happened, a snide comment, missing food, another expense pushed onto me, I wrote it down. I started saving receipts for every bill I paid. I took pictures of damage in the house and of her kids lounging around while I worked to pay for everything. She thought I was still the same quiet, passive person I'd been since moving back. She didn't know I was already preparing for the day when I'd finally turn the tables. After that night, I stopped reacting to her comments or her kids' little digs. On the outside, I acted the same as always, quiet, polite, never starting arguments. On the inside, I was working on something she didn't know about. I spent my evenings looking things up on my phone. I searched for information about property laws in my state, about what happens when two people own a house together, but can't agree. It took a while to sort through all the legal terms, but eventually I found what I needed. There was a way to force the sale of a property if both owners couldn't work it out. It wasn't quick or easy, but it was possible. Reading that gave me the first bit of hope I'd had in months. I realized I didn't have to wait for her to throw me out or make my life even harder. I could take action. I could get my share of the house and leave her to deal with the mess she'd created. The problem was that it would cost money, lawyers, court filings, and everything else that came with it. I didn't have much saved, but I started putting aside whatever I could. Every time I was supposed to pay her rent or give her money for utilities, I made it work while still slipping a little extra into a hidden envelope I kept at the bottom of my bag. At the same time, I became more careful about keeping proof of everything. I'd already started taking notes and photos, but now I kept every single receipt for the bills I paid. If I bought groceries and her kids ate them, I made a note of it. If something in the house got damaged because of them, like when her son spilled soda all over the couch, I took pictures right away. I wasn't sure how much of it would matter legally, but I wanted every bit of evidence I could gather. I even started recording small conversations when I could, especially when she made remarks about me owing her or when her kids admitted to breaking something. I never confronted them with any of it. I just smiled, nodded, and acted like I was too tired to care. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. At dinner, I'd sit across from her while she bragged about something her kids had done, pretending I wasn't thinking about the day I'd finally be rid of her. When she complained about money, I'd keep my face blank, knowing she had no idea I was saving to pay for the very thing that would get me out of her house. She thought she was in control. She thought I was still the same person she could push around. But every time I slipped a little more cash into that envelope, every time I added another piece of proof to my folder, I felt stronger. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not friends, not coworkers, not even extended family. The fewer people who knew, the better. If word got back to her, she might try something to stop me. So I kept working quietly, smiling when I had to, staying out of the way when her kids took over the living room, and nodding along when she talked about her plans for the house. She didn't know my plans were already in motion, and that one day soon, she'd find out exactly what I'd been preparing for. One evening, she called me into the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a stack of papers in front of her, acting like she was about to deliver important news. Without much build-up, she said the amount I paid her every month was going up by half. She called it adjusting for inflation, as if she was running some kind of business. I asked if her kids would also be paying more. She shook her head and said they didn't need to pay anything because they're family. She looked me in the eye like she was waiting for me to protest. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I just said, "All right," and left the room. What I didn't tell her was that I had no intention of giving her another cent. From that moment, every dollar I would have handed over went straight into the envelope I kept hidden away. I made sure my face stayed neutral whenever she reminded me about the new rate. She thought I was falling in line, but really I was speeding up my plan. A few days later, I was cleaning out some old boxes in the storage closet. Most of it was just my dad's old tools and papers, but at the bottom of one box was a small bundle wrapped in string. Inside were letters my dad had written years ago. Some were addressed to me, some were just notes he had written and never sent. In one, he talked about the house. He wrote that no matter what happened, he wanted it to stay in the family, our family. He said he hoped I would always live here if I wanted, and that it was meant to be my home. I sat on the floor reading his words over and over. Until then, I had been thinking of my plan as a way to get away from her. But now it felt different. This wasn't just about leaving. It was about making sure she couldn't erase what my dad wanted. The anger I'd been carrying for months began to sharpen. Every time she laughed with her kids in the living room while I sat in my room, every time she used my money for something I didn't benefit from, every time she made me feel like an outsider in my own home, it all pushed me closer to the moment I'd take it back from her. I tucked the letters away with my savings and my notes. They became another piece of what I was building. She thought she could keep raising the cost of my presence until I couldn't afford to stay. She didn't know I was counting down to the day she'd be the one packing her things instead. The day I went to the courthouse, the air felt heavier than usual. I had my folder with me, packed full of every photo, receipt, and note I'd collected over the past months. My hands were steady as I filled out the paperwork to file for a petition by sale. Once it was submitted, there was no going back. It meant the house would be sold whether she wanted it or not, and the money would be divided between us. I didn't tell her right away. I wanted the court notice to do the talking. A week later, she found the envelope in the mail and stormed into my room without knocking. She was holding the letter like it was on fire. Her face was red, and her voice shook when she asked, "What the hell is this?" I didn't look up from my desk. "It's exactly what it says," I replied. Her voice rose to a shout. She called me ungrateful, selfish, a parasite. She said after everything she had done for me, this was how I repaid her. Then she leaned closer and said she would destroy me before she let this happen. I turned and looked her in the eye for the first time in a long while. "You can try," I said. Then I reached for my folder. I laid out the receipts showing every payment I'd made for rent, utilities, and groceries. I showed her the photos of the damages her kids had caused, the broken closet door, the stains on the carpet, the dent in the hallway wall. I pulled out the notes of every time she had refused to make her children contribute. She stood there in silence for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find a response. Finally, she told me I was lying. I reminded her the court would see all of it. That was when she left the room, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. From that point on, the house was thick with tension. She stopped speaking to me except to mutter insults under her breath. Her kids glared at me every time I walked into the kitchen. But I didn't let it get to me. The process had already started, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The day we went to court, she came in dressed sharply, her children sitting behind her like a silent jury. She told the judge that she had taken me in out of kindness, that I was trying to push her out of her home. She tried to make it sound like I was taking advantage of her. When it was my turn, I kept my voice calm. I explained that the property was owned equally and that I had the right to request a sale. I presented every piece of evidence I had collected, receipts, photos, written notes. I showed proof that I had been paying while her children contributed nothing. I described the damage they had done and the way I had been treated. The judge asked her a few questions she couldn't answer without contradicting herself. Her kids shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I kept my focus on the judge, never looking at her. When the ruling came, it felt like the air finally cleared. The judge ordered the house to be sold and the profits split evenly. I could see the moment she realized she had lost. Her face went pale, and she stared straight ahead like she couldn't believe it was happening. I left the courtroom without saying a word to her. My hands felt lighter than they had in months. The plan I had started in secret was now moving forward, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. After the court ruling, she started acting like the whole thing wasn't final. She spent the next week pacing around the house, making phone calls, and whispering to her kids in the kitchen. I could hear her talking about finding a way to buy me out, but every conversation ended the same. She didn't have enough money. Her mood changed from angry to desperate. She met with a banker one day, then came home slamming doors. Another time, I overheard her on the phone with a relative, asking for a loan. From the sound of it, no one was willing to give her what she needed. Her kids weren't taking it well either. The first time they realized the sale meant they would have to move, they laughed like it was a joke. When it sank in that it was real, they stopped laughing. I caught pieces of their conversations, complaints about having to find a place, about how expensive rent was, about how they'd need jobs if they wanted to afford anything. They were used to living without responsibility, and now the idea of paying their own way seemed to hit them like a punch. One evening, she knocked on my door. Her tone was softer than I'd heard in years. She asked if we could talk. I let her in, and she sat on the edge of my bed, twisting her hands together. She said she knew we'd had our differences, but begged me to reconsider. She promised things would be different if I stayed. She even said I wouldn't have to pay as much every month. I listened without interrupting. When she finally stopped talking, I looked at her and said, "You wanted rent money. Here's my price, half the value of the house." She blinked at me like she couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. Then she stood up and left without another word. The sound of her footsteps down the hall felt like a final door closing. After that, she avoided me completely. She focused on her kids, who were now going through their own panic. I could hear them searching for apartments online, cursing about security deposits, and groaning about the cost of everything. For the first time, they were facing the reality most people dealt with every day. I didn't offer advice. I didn't offer sympathy. I just kept packing away my things, knowing that soon the house would belong to someone else entirely, and that I'd be walking away with the part that was mine. Everything she had tried to keep from me was finally slipping through her fingers. The for sale sign went up in the yard on a clear morning. I stood at my window and watched the real estate agent hammer it into the ground. It felt strange seeing it there after all these years, but I didn't feel sad. I felt ready. The house drew a lot of attention. People came and went every day for showings, walking through the rooms I'd known my whole life. I stayed out of the way and let the agent handle everything. She was good at her job, and within a few weeks we had several strong offers. The one we accepted was more than I expected, enough that I knew I could buy a place of my own without taking on any debt. When the sale was finalized, I went to the closing with a calmness I hadn't felt in months. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and just like that, the house was no longer ours. My share of the money was wired to my account the same day. Seeing the number there made me realize how worth it all the planning had been. She didn't take it well. After the sale, she packed her things with a tight, bitter expression. I heard her telling her kids that they would all move into a 2-bedroom apartment across town. It was smaller, older, and far from the comfortable setup they had in the house. She kept her voice sharp, but I could hear the strain underneath. Her kids complained the loudest. They didn't like the idea of sharing a room, or of living somewhere without space for all their stuff. I knew the rent would still be coming from her pocket, because neither of them had found steady work. She was walking into a life that was going to be harder every single month, but that wasn't my problem anymore. With my share of the money, I started looking for a new place. I wanted something that felt nothing like the old house. No ghosts of arguments, no memories of walking on eggshells. I found a small, bright home in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The day I got the keys, I stood in the empty living room and just listened to the silence. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling someone's disapproval hanging over me. I could leave my coffee mug in the sink if I want. I could have friends over without asking anyone's permission. I could stock my fridge and know my food would still be there the next day. I furnished the place slowly, choosing things I actually liked instead of things I thought would keep someone else happy. Each choice felt like another step away from the life I had left behind. The air felt lighter here, and the walls held no tension. Every morning, I woke up without that knot in my stomach. I didn't have to brace myself for some petty comment or a new demand. I didn't have to listen to her voice or her kids' mocking laughter. All I heard was quiet, and sometimes the distant sound of birds outside my window. I had traded years of being treated like a guest in my own home for something better. My own space, my own freedom, and a peace I hadn't realized I'd been craving for so long. A few months after I settled into my new place, life felt calm. I had almost stopped thinking about her and the house. Then one afternoon, I got a call from someone who still knew her. They started telling me what had been going on since the sale, and I couldn't help but listen. It turned out things hadn't been going well for her. The apartment she had moved into was more expensive than she expected, and her kids hadn't kept their promises about finding jobs. They still spent most of their time lounging around, but now there was no extra space, no big kitchen, and no steady flow of money for me to keep them comfortable. The breaking point came when both kids moved out without warning. One had left to stay with a friend, the other moved in with a girlfriend. They hadn't helped with rent, and they left her behind with overdue bills and a pile of debt from the apartment and other expenses. Without their company, she was stuck paying everything alone. She had gone from living in my dad's house for free to struggling just to cover a small apartment. From what I heard, she'd even started looking for a roommate to help make ends meet. The thought of her having to share her space with a stranger made me laugh. I didn't say anything to the person telling me all this. I just thanked them for the update and hung up. But later that night, I took out my phone and typed a short message. It only took me a moment to decide exactly what to write. Enjoy paying rent in your own home. I hit send and set the phone down. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. But just knowing she had read it was enough. It wasn't about the money anymore. I had already gotten my share and moved on. What felt good was knowing she had ended up in the exact position she had tried to put me in, paying to live somewhere while the people around her took advantage and left her to deal with the bills. I thought about all the times she told me I was lucky to have a roof over my head, all the times she called me entitled while her kids lived off me for free. Now she was the one struggling, and no one was stepping in to make her life easier. It was quiet in my home that night. I sat in my chair, drinking coffee, feeling lighter than I had in years. She had finally learned what it was like, and I didn't need to see her face to know exactly how much she hated it.